So I'm going to talk about false positives in policy research, and we're in sort of a second wave of the credibility crisis in social sciences. So there's been this recent interest in longstanding issues of false positives in social science research, and I'm just going to use that very broadly. When I say false positive, I just mean any time that there really is not an effect that we report an effect for whatever reason. Okay, so broadly false positive. That's what I mean. And so this is not about causal identification strategies, okay? What Angrist and Pischke called the credibility revolution does not solve the problem that I'm going to talk about today, okay? So despite RCTs and RDs and IVs, some findings, perhaps many, are fragile at best, right? And so in the last few years, there have been cases of prominent professors being dismissed from their universities over outright fraud, fabricated data, fake results. But probably more pervasive is just that we have a number of ways to cut our sample or specify the model that can generate a false positive when there's really not an effect, okay? Okay, so 3 reasons for false positive. Let's just review this from statistics. So we can have sampling error, right? So valid inferential technique, the researcher doesn't do anything wrong, but you just get a bad draw, right? And you get a false positive that way. There's not really an effect, but there is one in your sample due to sampling error, okay? File drawer, where whole studies are left unpublished. We only see the published record. So the studies that we see, even a few of them, look like they show results, but what we're seeing is just the right tail of a sampling distribution centered at 0. Okay, that's sort of the file drawer effect. Pervasive more in laboratory experiments. And then what I'm going to talk about today is what I'll call p-hacking. Okay? That's when you adjust your analysis sample in some way, either through the model specification or who you're testing it on, until you find a significant coefficient on the variable of interest. Okay? It's sometimes called specification search or massaging the data. But it basically, if p-hacking exists, right, what we imagine the behavior to be is that you're tinkering with your model until you just cross the significance threshold. You're not going to hack down to p equals 0.0001. That's going to be very difficult to do when you have a null effect. It's going to be comparatively easier to get something past a 0.05 or 0.1 threshold. So what that creates is bunching around particular statistical thresholds, okay? And so clustering in economics, bunching at the 0.1 and 0.05 levels. This is QJE, AER, and JPE. These are not too shabby, okay? Clustering in economics. Clustering in political science, a 3-fold jump at the 0.05 level, okay? That's not a smooth transition, okay? 3 times more 0.049s than 0.051s. Clustering in sociology, a 2-fold jump at that threshold. Slightly better, but pretty bad, okay? So the contribution of the analysis that I'm going to present today, does this sound weird? Is this metallic? Okay, good. You're good in the camera. Okay, so for the 2 people that watch this, you'll be able to hear me really well. So I'm formally modeling p-hacking, okay, for technical reasons that I can go into if anybody wants to hear it, but I doubt it. And then I'm going to focus on rigorous policy research. So those showed you clustering in various disciplines in high-level journals, but maybe they're theoretical papers, maybe they're laboratory experiments. So we want to know what's happening in the kind of rigorous work that we're trying to get policymakers to use, okay? So how do we detect p-hacking? So 3 social psychologists created this estimation strategy recently, and it leverages the fact that the observed distribution of p-values can tell you something about the full distribution, okay? So there are 2 shapes that a distribution of p-values can take without p-hacking. So let me just ask, if we're running thousands of experiments and all the nulls are true, what proportion of effects will cross the 0.05 threshold? 5%. It's actually what a p-value means. It's rolled up in the definition, okay? What proportion will cross the 0.04 threshold? 4%. 0.03, 3%. So there will be 1% of p-values in between 0.05 and 0.04, 1% between 0.04 and 0.03, and so on and so on. The distribution of p-values under all nulls being true is uniform. It's uniform across the entire support of p-values, so you can slice off that distribution anywhere you want and it should be uniform. That's if there are no effects ever. As you get more and more effects, you will get a greater and greater right skew depending on the power of the studies. Okay, so you'll see more 0.01, more in the neighborhood of 0.01 than 0.05. Okay, more in the neighborhood of 0.02 than 0.08, if some at least studies are decently powered and real. So we're either seeing uniform or right skew. There is no natural distribution of p-values. I know this is a fascinating topic. There's no natural distribution of p-values that's left skewed. Left skewed is bunching at 0.05. So if you see a left skewed distribution of p-values, there's p-hacking in there. There is no other explanation for that except sampling error. Okay? All right. So it should be uniform or flat. Flat or right skewed. Okay, so this is what a p-curve looks like. So this is left skew. It's this line that you want to pay attention to. These are articles in the Journal of Experimental Psychology that only reported an effect when it was mediated by another variable. So these laboratory experiments only reported the treatment effect on women and not the full sample. They only reported the treatment effect on younger kids and not the full sample of kids. So these social psychologists, that drew their suspicion. They did a p-curve of this, and sure enough, we get bunching at 0.05. There's another set of articles that does not display that. That's right skew, and that's strong evidence. And these articles reported all effects. They didn't select out a particular one that looked fishy. Okay, so guys good with that? Okay. So is there p-hacking in policy research? So I thought about, let's look at the best case scenario. And the best case scenario is the most rigorous research that we have. And fortunately, a couple of the clearinghouses, the only two that I knew of at the time that I started this, apparently there are more now, sort of mine through the literature and rate them on their causal, their internal validity strategy, right? And so I took p-values out of the What Works Clearinghouse and the Clearinghouse for Labor Evaluation and Research. And when we're talking about prestigious policy research, JPAM is the obvious source for going there as well. I didn't want to make the journal results local to JPAM, so I added two other journals that were thought to be similar about 15 years ago as JPAM, the JHR, and the EEPA. Maybe they're not so similar now. I don't know. It's a judgment call. Okay, so remember, good, bad, ugly. All right? So that is strong right skew in policy research. That is good evidence. This is the null of no evidence, and p-hacking would create a skew over here. That's left skewed, okay? So I think we can breathe a small sigh of relief that at least this research that we're trying to push policymakers to use is not that biased. When you break it down by source, the journals look less right skewed than the clearinghouses. That's not necessarily bad. It has to do with power and other things. The clearinghouses look pretty strongly right skewed, but you can't reject them at my sample size from each other. Okay? This is also, the difference here is not due to method. So RCTs versus non-RCTs, it doesn't really make a difference. Still strong right skew. Again, this is good. Okay? There was a slight problem, and it ties into what I'm going to quickly talk about next. Only 68% of the papers had p-values that I could precisely calculate or reported precisely. And when I say precisely, I mean to 2 digits. I mean not very precisely at all. Okay? So there's the table breakdown. Some of them only reported significance levels, and a good chunk, 14%, were missing entirely. They said there's a significant effect, and they didn't even give the significance level. Okay? That's not very transparent, and that's worrisome. So I coded up a worst case scenario and coded all of them according to either the real p-value, the significance level if they reported that, or I gave it a 0.1, p-hacked right at 0.1 if they were missing completely. So this next graph is by construction going to look worse. It's an upper bound on the problem, okay? So the clearinghouses still look pretty good. The journal looks considerably flatter, and you can distinguish them from one another. So this is the worst case scenario. This is where all of the missing p-values are sort of being p-hacked, okay? So I think there's strong evidence in policy research so far. okay? There are a couple of limitations to what I've just shown you. One is that I've done this for a body of literature, not any individual study. We can't say anything specifically about a single study. A p-value of 0.05 is just fine once, but you just shouldn't see an abundance of them compared to others. And what will happen as increasingly we want it to, federal funding to be tied to the results of these RCTs, that's going to create incentives for people to do fishy things to get the money, okay? Sort of like the drug trial industry was about 15 years ago. So we know what transparent science looks like. There are sort of 3 principles of transparent social science. The question is, how do we incentivize people? What can APPAM do to incentivize researchers to be more transparent in their research so that it's credible? And I'm just going to put up a graph. So this is the proportion by year of your data and code being available in the AJPS or the APSR. In 2009, the AJPS got a new editor and made code and data availability his pet project, and immediately it jumped to almost 100%. 100% of the papers submitted there had to put their data and code online in some form. Okay, the APSR, also a very prestigious political science journal, wanted data and code to be available, but didn't push it as strongly. And look at that effect. Not much of one. Okay, so this is all an intro to say that journal editorial policies matter. And if you want researchers to do something, that's a good place to start. So what can APPAM do to make research more credible is really what can JPAM do to make research more credible. So these are just a list of some potential solutions to increase the transparency and credibility of policy research going forward. Endorse principles, as other journals have. Encourage registration and pre-analysis plans for randomized control trials especially. Make code and data sharing the default, as the AER and AJPS do right now. And perhaps a symposium. Norms are still evolving in the transparency movement. And so, it's creating a turf war in social psychology right now. Economics is just sort of slowly slipping in. So how policy researchers want to deal with this is still open to debate. And APPAM can perhaps sponsor a workshop, or when I presented this, a professor in my department said a reproduction contest for graduate students would be fun. So I'm just going to leave you with a quick anecdote, and then I'll hand it over. Why does transparency make research more credible, especially to policymakers? Amy Finkelstein and her colleagues in 2012 published the analysis of the Oregon health insurance experiment, okay? One of her co-authors was an architect of Obamacare and said some perhaps truthful but inflammatory things about the American public's ability to understand things. If you are a Republican policymaker and you see this paper, one of whom authors is an architect of Obamacare, do you think those results are credible? Well, they knew that this was a politically charged environment, so before they started collecting the data, they published a pre-registration plan that detailed every test that they were going to run, every dependent variable that they were going to test, exactly how they were going to code it, and then in the published article, they used a special symbol next to any hypothesis that they did not specifically pre-register. And I think that had a real impact on how credible those results were. And so it's something to think about as we move forward.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Arif Mamun. By your presence here, you and the incredible day outside, you're showing tremendous commitment to building credible evidence. So I'll share with you my thoughts on researcher bias and registration of pre-analysis plans that Sean already mentioned. All of which could enhance possibly the integrity of experimental evaluations in social programs. So just to set up the context, and we all know that the randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for estimating impacts. They're the sort of the convincing and reliable way of establishing a counterfactual, sort of what the world would have been absent the intervention that we're studying. Now, in recent years, there's been quite a bit of proliferation of trials in public policy research, not only in the US, but also internationally. And I'm not talking about trials run by businesses as they change their business practices. So there are estimates out there that Google ran, for example, 12,000 experiments in the year 2009 alone. Capital One, a local bank here, runs about 60,000 experiments every year. So we're not talking about that, but still, for social policy evaluation, since the first large-scale social experiment, the negative income tax experiment that Mathematica was a part of, we have seen dozens of experiments being introduced each year for social program evaluation. And equally importantly, trials are being recognized by policymakers as important source of information. Recently, in 2012, OMB, Office of Management and Budget, suggested that federal agencies provide evidence from RCTs as part of their budget request. In 2002, IES, Department of Education, established the What Works Clearinghouse to assess rigor of evidence and synthesize evidence. On the international development side, Millennium Challenge Corporation was founded in 2004. They're very much focused on rigorous evaluations and results. Slightly going outside of the borders here, in Mexico in 2005, the government established an independent agency to evaluate social policy programs, the Coneval. In 2008, 3IE was established, so the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. So all of those things indicate that the general recognition of value of RCTs. But an important question here is, are we being transparent about conducting RCTs that Sean already introduced us to? What's the role of researcher bias in RCTs? Are results replicable? Do all results get published? What can we do to mitigate the potential for researcher bias? So these are the kinds of issues that I'm going to highlight in my remarks here. And I want to underscore that whatever I'm talking about today here is not new, not even my own. A lot of people have been talking about these things for a while, sharing ideas. I'm simply reiterating these issues to continue the conversation and generate further discussion. All right, so what is researcher or experimenter bias? Simply, it means who performs the result, research influences the results. Put differently, it's intentional or unintentional reporting of selective results to achieve a certain outcome. And typically, it's demonstrated by lack of replicability. And I'm not talking about differences in technical judgment about detailed analytic issues, but basic lack of replicability. And also non-public publication of null or negative results, which Sean referred to as the file drawer effect. I'll talk about that a little more in a few minutes. I want to underscore one point here at the outset, that influencing the outcome of an RCT is an ethical failure and it constitutes a research misconduct. Every time we hear research misconduct, it immediately sort of reminds us of some sort of data manipulation, someone withholding some part of the sample or some part of the data to get to a result that they want to. But it could also be the case that I'm simply not writing up results from an experiment that's showing null results, and just because I know that those results are not going to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. It's in those instances we need to remember that it is our ethical obligation to the participants of the trial, some of whom may have actually participated in the trial because it would be good for the society at large, and we as researchers owe it to them that we reveal the results no matter what the outcome is. All right, so let me talk about the potential factors, some of the potential factors that underlie researcher bias. The first one I would mention is fishing for results. Now, that's not necessarily bad if we are doing exploratory research. Exploratory research could be done using data from an RCT, but typically RCTs are set up to test an hypothesis, to see whether an intervention X changed outcome Y, whether a job training program improved the likelihood of paid employment for the participants, right? So if we are doing an exploratory research, let's just frame it that way and not put the burden on such exploratory research by putting them into the same group as conducting an RCT set up to test some hypothesis. But a related issue is ignoring multiple testing problems. And as many of you know, that multiple testing happens when, if you're running 100 tests at 10% significance level, the point that Sean mentioned a few minutes ago, you're going to see, or you could see, 10 results coming out to be statistically significant just by chance, even if there was no true impact that had occurred. And if we don't account for that, then, and simply run with those 10 significant results, then we're fishing for results that are not that informative, right? So publication bias is, the file drawer effect is another big factor behind researcher bias, and I want to come back to it and spend a little more time, so I'll come back to it in the next slide. The other factor is gainful interest in selected results, and mention of gainful interest reminds you of industry-funded research. But it could also happen from the researcher's professional or social interest, right? Just to make the point about the industry-funded research, there is some evidence from medicine trials that industry-funded research is less likely to be published than non-industry-funded research. A paper published in British Medical Journal in 2013 showed that out of the 585 trials that were registered on the clinicaltrials.gov run by NIH, they found that 1 in 3 industry-funded research trials were not publishing any results, compared to 1 in 6 in non-industry-funded results. So there is some evidence that comes out of that. But it can happen also in social science. I don't have any evidence of that happening, and but it's possible that researchers funded by a particular agency or a sponsor could be motivated to show a certain type of results, and they could do that through self-censorship too. That if a researcher finds null or negative results, they simply don't publish, and it's also to their incentive. So the incentives sort of align when you see some publication bias sort of overlapping with this issue. And if I have a particular social or professional interest about the program I'm studying, I should be, registering it ahead of time, sort of disclose it that I have this interest. It may or may not bias my actual research, but it'll be fair to just disclose that, as Sean mentioned as the anecdote in his talk. And I'd point out that fraud and human error are other factors. Fraud is very difficult to detect. January 2015 post on the Washington Post, an article on the Washington Post by Joel Achenbach mentioned this Dutch professor admitting to fabricating data for years. Those kinds of events probably are rare, but it's also hard to detect. But there is probably an element of fraud and human error involved in researcher bias. Right? So coming back to publication bias, what it really means is studies with statistically significant positive results are more likely to be published in peer-reviewed journals than null or negative results. And this has been identified for social sciences in a recent paper published in the journal Science in 2014 that looked at 221 trials out of the time sharing for experiments in the social sciences, and found that positive results are 40 percentage point more likely to be published and 60 percentage point more likely to be written up. So the upshot, so the other side of it is basically a lot of these trials that are showing null or negative results are not getting published or even getting written up. The same has been recognized for medicine trials. The article published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2012 looked at all FDA trials of 12 antidepressants, and 37 of the 38 studies showing positive results were published versus 3 out of the 36 showing negative results. So, and this has been shown in various other reviews. I mentioned a few there, all basically pointing out that trials with positive results are twice to 5 times more likely to be published than null or negative results, right? So what happens with this kind of publication bias is that authors would generally not find it to their interest to write about null or negative results, and they may not send it to the journal for publication if they are worried about not being published. They may not simply write about those trials. And as a result, if we derive some policy conclusions based on published results, then it is going to be incomplete, and we have to be cautious about taking policy messages away from that kind of review. And it's important for the policymakers to know about null results as it is for them to know about positive results. I mean, what works and what doesn't work, both, to me, are equally important for policymaking. Just for an example, the teacher induction study done by Mathematica a few years ago now showed that there was no impact of comprehensive induction services to teacher attitudes, teacher retention, or student test score. I would imagine that it's valuable information for education policymakers. The fact that the Building Strong Families study showed no positive results of offering classes and relationship skills training to couples, it doesn't work. It's helpful for policymakers to know that. Okay, so a couple of, let's see. So thinking about what could be done about addressing researcher bias in RCTs, there have been quite a few recent initiatives. The first of which is registering the trials. And various registries have been established by professional groups of economists, psychologists, political scientists. And just to contrast sort of the social science public policy research with medicine trials, we have FDA that governs all of the trials and is mandated to register all of the trials before for every drug trial that's happening. For social sciences and public policy research, probably authoritative registry like that wouldn't work given the diversity of disciplines and that. And in addition, also having an authoritative registry is also very hard to implement. Even with legal backing, FDA's registries are basically not registering about 1 in 5 trials still. Since 2007, they've started enforcing this. So that's one initiative that's happening. The other initiative is making pre-analysis plans public that Sean mentioned already. And this can happen in a couple of different ways. First off, it could happen through the registries of the trial. So some of the trials actually have designated items for registering your analysis plan. The American Economics Association registry, for example, has that. Another way you can register your pre-analysis plans, particularly for federally funded research, is that many of these evaluations funded by the federal agencies are producing design reports that include pre-analysis plans. And I'll just provide a couple of examples that I've been personally involved with. The Youth Transition Demonstration Evaluation funded by the Social Security Administration. We published the analysis plan in 2009 for analysis we've done in 2011 and 2014. We've done the same for another recent evaluation we started, the PROMISE evaluation, again funded by SSA. And there we have already published our analysis plan for analysis that we'll do in 2018 and 2022. We're doing it for international development research. One of the evaluations we're doing in Namibia, for example, has a design report along with an analysis plan. So those things could be done for many of the research cases. Now, one concern that's raised often about registering pre-analysis plan is, would it stifle research, stifle constructive, creative research? I would like to disagree, because if we are doing exploratory research, as I mentioned before, we could still do the exploratory research without putting the burden of an RCT of testing hypothesis. All right, so there are some other practical challenges in terms of getting funded for pre-analysis plans. And also oftentimes we're running against the clock about implementing the random assignment while the implementers are waiting to go ahead. So that could be a challenge. So those are practical issues that needs to be worked out. And then addressing multiple testing problem, we can apply formal testing versus applying some transparent decision rules that could be. So I'll just skip those in the interest of time and just go to the final slide where what could APPAM do? First off, it could definitely facilitate more conversations like this, and then also encourage research sponsors to require a pre-analysis plan and perhaps publish pre-analysis plan when they're available on the agency websites. And maybe APPAM could also facilitate presentation of pre-analysis plan and publication of those. So that could be another way to contribute here. APPAM could convene a group of experts to assess the methodological implications of imposing standardizing pre-analysis plans. And we're more or less seeing a frequentist paradigm running here, and considering sort of the Bayesian computational options might be useful. JPAM could take the lead on publishing null results. An enhanced disclosure requirement could be imposed, not only regarding funding, but also any public support for a particular program that's being studied. It would be similar to what the National Academy of Sciences does for its panelists. And then ultimately, I mean, we all want to be an environment where null or negative results are accepted as well as positive results, and we have a comprehensive, complete body of evidence for policymakers. Thank you.
Well, I'm going without overheads is my unplanned approach for today. I thought I had a different flash drive and I took the wrong one with me. So you get to see the unprepared approach to making a presentation. As somebody who served as the editor of JPAM for a decade, I wish I could say that there was never any unethical behavior in the policy world among scholars, but there is. It's not, in my opinion, it's not a frequent occurrence, but it has happened. Upon occasion, we find things that we wish we didn't uncover, actually, at the end of the day, because it always requires a fair amount of work and lawyers, which is never a good thing. Nonetheless, when I talk about how to get published in JPAM, I never think of saying, bring me a big, juicy result. I need to have a p-value of .0 something and an effect size of blank. It's not on the list. It was never on the list. My general view is that you need to pick a big, juicy, interesting, and if possible, controversial question. You know, bring me something that's going to grab people's interest. Bring me a topic that I care about, for heaven's sakes. Don't bring me something that shows how clever I am, and I've used all my cleverness and money on something absolutely trivial, because there are other journals for that. I could name some of them, but I won't. I'm actually interested, and always have been interested in something that's important and that we care about, that we don't know about. And I'm just as happy, sometimes even more happy, to publish a null result than a positive result. So we have had papers, I try to bring them in where somebody says, WIC works, it looks good, and then the next issue, WIC doesn't work. You know, and you measured it wrong. Measure it like this, and you'll see that it doesn't work. And then we have the next issue, a does it or doesn't it? You know, kind of group of scholars weighing in. Or abstinence-only sex education doesn't work. Awesome, I wanted to know that. I would like to know if other kinds of sex education also don't work as well. Taking out the abstinence-only piece, because I would have published null results on that as well and have found it to be fascinating, equally fascinating. So I don't think, in my mind, in policy, in the policy arena, the statistical significance and magnitude of the effects are really important. It's doing something that's new or brings something new to the table and is interesting and is important. So the things that I looked at had nothing actually to do with effect sizes or statistically significant results. As a principle, when you're writing for JPAM, I can't talk about all journals, but I kind of like the keep it simple, stupid principle, or the KISS principle. Papers that have truly convoluted identification strategies are very difficult to explain to people who actually conduct policy and are responsible for policy making in any area. So truly complicated identification schemas also tend to be rather fragile, and that your results are not robust to that specification. And that always makes me nervous relative to having a straightforward identification strategy. So if you come to JPAM with a very clever IV, for example, that's where I think it's incumbent on you as a research community to do a great deal of sensitivity analysis around your results. so that we know how fragile or robust they are to differences, modest differences, and even more than modest differences in your specification. There is an online appendix that you could put in, but in a couple of paragraphs you say, we tried this, we tried that, we did this, we did that. It didn't make a difference, or it made a big difference, or these results don't hold up under all circumstances, or for all people, or for all cities. And then have some discussion about that if we have variation. And we know there's a lot of heterogeneous response. So we don't expect everyone to react the same way to any particular intervention. When I talk about publishing in scholarly publishing in general, I talk about where I think our field is moving. And so I'm going to just point out a couple of things where I think where the field is going and how that interacts with this issue of replicability, honesty, robustness of results. We are moving rapidly towards RCTs. It used to be the provenance of only the large think tanks, and that has certainly changed. There are field experiments run by people all over throughout the academy and far outside now of the large think tanks. So those are simple designs. You can still screw them up, okay? You can mess up a social experiment as easily as you can mess up anything else. Right? But provided they are well executed, the results are relatively easy to convey and more convincing because of the issues of selection bias. We don't need to deal with them in complex econometric methods. Okay? I think that makes the issue of transparency less problematic when we have relatively straightforward methods that we use. We are also operating in an environment where I believe you will see more and more complete, comprehensive, detailed, longitudinal and cross-sectional, administratively linked data. Okay? The magnitude of the completeness of our data sets is almost unreal, where you'll find in some states health records, education records, from grammar school through community colleges, universities, jail records, the list goes on and on, pensions, and so on. They link everything for everyone so that you have a very comprehensive profile. We used to have a lot of stuff in the error term, and we'd go, oh, well, we think this might be important, but we don't have data on it. Or we think this might be important, but, well, we don't have data on that either. And, that's what the error term is for. And so those excuses are going away because we have more and better data, which allow us to address new and more interesting questions and do it in a more compelling way. Those data, because they are available publicly in many cases with just asking for permission and filling out forms and guaranteeing that you will not disclose individual identities and keep those data safe, should make replication easier. And provide greater transparency, I would argue. There are two other, I think, major directions in which our field is moving, and I think we are on the precipice of these changes. And I'm not as entirely clear about what they will do for replicability and transparency in the sizes of effects that we do or don't have. And I'm a little bit worried about that because we just don't have a good grasp on that yet. And the first of these is that we're starting to integrate in a fairly major way traditional social science research with neurological and genetic data. We have health data sets that are coming now with the full genome, human genome, of over 1 million new variables. And you could easily p-hack. And not only could you easily p-hack, because we don't know what a whole bunch of that stuff is or how it could or should relate. As policy researchers, I could see the opportunity for p-hacking the human genome with that volume of variables in there. I don't think you should go do it. I think that's a bad idea. I'm not encouraging this. I am a little concerned that that could be an issue. I think we need to work more with the medical community. We have education scholars working in neuroscience with brain scans, and again, there's probably hundreds of thousands of variables that you can pull out of those things, pulling out the right stuff, integrating it in a way that makes sense to help us figure out what works best for kids of different kinds of kids and under different kinds of circumstances is, I think, a absolutely useful and valuable thing to do. But I do think we need to extend our reach into the community, the medical community, if we're going to start using these data. Mucking around in your data is probably not a good idea when we know very little about these types of data, unless you are an MD, PhD, in which case I apologize. I'm not talking to you. But for the rest of us, the big data, we all hear about big data. We know big data are coming. Big data are here, actually. They're not coming. They have arrived. And we talk about big data, but we don't actually, as a group and as a community of scholars, we are not using big data yet. I'm just starting to see things being published that use big data, and we're just at the very frontier of that. Does that worry me a little bit from this point of view? Actually, I think it's going to be awesome. However, okay, and I can't wait to read about some of these things. But from a replicability point of view, these are data streams. They are massive data streams. They require specialized computing. They require talent that we don't necessarily have at our fingertips, and the ability to replicate when the data is a massive stream or flow, or some people will even say a tsunami of data, is something that we're going to have to try and think about, because it's not cross-sectional, longitudinal. I mean, we can cut big data into slices or little dribbles, but we're going to have to think about how to deal with the replicability issue. My guess is those results, if the same person used the same method again and again and again and again, are going to change over time, because the data are going to change over time. Capturing, storing, making it available to other people in order to utilize is going to be a real challenge. I think using it's going to be a challenge for us. We have not been trained in how to utilize, how to scrape data. What does that mean? Okay? I mean, I hear it. Oh, I scrape data. So what did you do? Like, what did you do to those data? Those poor data are now scraped somewhere. But it's like I collected them, I sifted them, I have them. It's like, talk to me. What are you talking about? But we know it's happening. There's a generation of people who know how to do this, who are in that game, and the ability to replicate, to really understand what they're doing, is certainly not there at this point in time. So I'm a little bit concerned about the big data from this point of view only, although I think it would be awesome fun to figure out how to do that. I can tell you just dozens of ideas that would be cool to do if I knew how to do them, which I don't. So bummer for me. But maybe good for my doctoral students who can figure it out.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes for open conversation. I wanted to take the prerogative of the chair and just put a few little issues out there for those of you in the audience and our panelists to think about. So one is I just want to sort of distinguish between reporting bias and replicability, because these things, as I went through the literature, they get mixed up a little bit. So one thing is did you do the analysis and it's someplace, but we don't know where it is and we don't have access to it. Replicability could be an issue of, do we have stability of the findings across studies, and the reporting bias could feed into that, but it's somewhat of a different issue. And another theme that is in the literature that I think is really important for us to think about is replication versus what is being referred to as accumulation of evidence, or the cumulative meta-analysis, if you will. So if I do a small study and I get a point estimate and a p-value or confidence interval, and we do 5 more, what should we do? Should we be lining these studies up and comparing them, or should we be pooling the results across those 5 studies? And so, should we think about this as accumulation of the knowledge base? And part of that depends upon whether we keep getting these holes or the p-hacking going on in there. But I think that's important to sort of think about that. And then I just want to put out there my pet thing, which is, what do we think would it help the whole process if we eliminated the emphasis on p-values and thought about another metric, which is confidence intervals around point estimates? My sense is if that was the main thing that we were reporting, it might just be more informative to our practitioner partners who understand that, and it might also be a disincentive to, then we don't have that incentive to to focus on particular points in the distribution. So that might be helpful. So with that, I'm going to, anybody here have something? I would like to give the audience a little bit of a chance to come back at you. So quick.
Just a definitional, because I think sorry. Just want to throw out that you're right, replication isn't something that we should naturally expect. In fact, non-replication tells us something about a different context. And so I want to just distinguish that between reproduction, which is actually taking the same data and the same analysis and producing the same tables, a la Reinhardt and Rogoff, or whatever these big cases where a student has done this and not been able to actually reproduce the same tables. And so we should demand reproduction but not expect replication, I think is right.
Floor is open.
So I'm supposed to repeat how much of that?
Just saying, would journals?
Yeah, so is there a selection bias out of the journals that require data encode into others? And I think that's what makes a nice natural experiment with the AJPS and the APSR. And the question is open: what happens to the articles that are published under that environment? I think the QJE still does not require data encode as the AER and the other AEA journals do. So yeah, there's variation. What can we learn from it? There's a study I know of that looked at biology journals that required code and data and those that didn't, and the articles cited in those, the citation count went up for articles that shared their data and code. Now there's, selection bias issues and things like that I don't know how to interpret that. But yeah, this is an open area of research. I think it would be interesting for a journal to do a symposium on how we grapple with these issues as we move forward.
At one point, I was asked about whether or not JPAM should require the data to be posted, and it was a topic of an editorial board meeting. And it was there was a lot of disagreement within the community, the 40 or 50 scholars around the table, about whether or not we ought to require data to be posted. And in a lot of cases, the data are available if you access the data, make an application and so on, but you can't just put the data up because you had to go through a process to get that data. And in other cases, especially in the larger think tanks, they had gotten these data under contract, and it wasn't really possible for them to make it available, and they were very nervous about taking away a important publication venue for them. So I think at the end of the day, we thought about it a fair amount and decided not to go ahead and pursue that, although it's conceivable that one could make it optional. You know, encourage people to do it whenever it's possible, or ask people to get a dispensation if they have contractual or other reasons they can't do it. But the type of data we use in general don't really lend themselves to being put online in a large, I would argue probably more than half the cases. I could imagine this being a real issue for the authors. So, and I can even see cases where people have spent 2 or 3 years collecting their own data, and they're not really keen on making it available for everyone else to use. So, and I think you're weighing things as an editor. You're going, do I want the best research, or do I want the best research with data that can be made available with coding publicly? And if you know there's really, one's a small subset of the other, and you're taking a big bite out of that, you may not want to go with the data, requiring data to be posted.
Yes, Myron.
Thanks. If I could push back on your statement, the National Academies wrestled with this in 1985 and issued a report sharing research data, which NIH picked up many years later to have its policy of data being made available, which NSF picked up to have its data available. And now we have this whole open science movement. It hasn't swept across the US, but it's swept across the UK. And it's pressing here. So, I mean, I think it's a matter of time, and it's a question of what are the ethics of the association and society that it wants to promulgate, not just in its journals, but in all other manners of activity.
Thank you. I think with that, we're going to close down. I will, and just one response to that is that the Department of Education has increased its requirements around restricted use data files and publishing data from the grants that it is making. So it's not universal, but there's a movement in that direction. So there's so much to talk about. I'm sorry we had only 1 hour here because this is a really big issue, but let's keep the conversation going. And thank you all for coming on a beautiful Saturday. Go enjoy the day. Thank you, panelists.